Well, one of the things about freedom is that the Christian is Lord of all, subject to none, but also turns around after being made free. And what does he do? He enslaves himself immediately, and not just to one or two, but to everyone. And I have enslaved myself to slave masters who have told me now that I am not to go beyond the hours, the minutes themselves. I'm watching this, and now I also know something else. I'm watching all of your eyes as you're going along. We don't want you to drift off. And some of you are going to start looking at the stained glass out here, which is, I understand now, it gives you a 3D effect when things get boring. All right, so I think I've got this all figured out. And we are going to be going, I'm telling myself here now, we go until 4:30, is that right? Is that right? Or we? Oh, yeah. Well, some of you, look, people occasionally ask me, what is heaven going to be like? Heaven is going to be just like this, but I'm going to go through the whole thing. None of you are going to be getting up and saying, could we just cut it off? It could just, shorten it just a little bit. That's what heaven is going to be like, if any of you have wondered. All right, so what we're working on now is Luther's Freedom of a Christian, which he writes in 1520. And there are a couple of really big things that come out of that. One of that, we've mentioned already. Luther uses 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19 as his main text. And when he uses it as his main text, he notes that there are two contrary theses. So he says the rest of the writing is not going to have one thesis, which then you're supposed to support. All of you remember this from school, right? You learn that you had one thesis, then you have to support the thesis. Then at the end of it, you have to say what you said at the beginning of it. That's what it's all about. That's what Aristotle taught us. Then Luther says, that's exactly what I'm not going to do. Instead, I'm going to give you two theses, not one, and they are going to be opposites one another. And this, of course, becomes a major part of what he's talking about in the freedom of the Christian. The second thing to remember about this is that it was organized as a treatise after Luther was asked to write a letter to the Pope. Now, you might wonder why he would do this. He was already under some terrific pressure. The Pope was already out hunting deer and wild hogs. And he was getting the idea that this Luther would have to be gotten rid of. There would be a wild boar, of course, he writes, as he's getting ready to condemn Luther. This was already going on, and there was a guy that decided he was going to help both Luther and the Pope by the name of Miltitz. And Miltitz was what today you would call a swamp creature. He was a bureaucrat, right? So he steps in and he says that I'm going to help this whole situation and I'm going to arrange it so that Luther and the Pope get along very well. He just asked Luther to sit down and write a letter to the Pope. And of course, what Miltitz wanted was for Luther to subject himself to, say, oh, Pope, I'm so sorry about everything I've said and done and so on. But what does Luther do? Luther says, well, okay, if you want me to write a letter, I'm going to do it. And he writes a love letter to the Pope. It's wild. I mean, everybody still is talking about this. He knew what the Pope was doing. He writes a love letter to the Pope. And he says, Dear Pope Leo X, I just want to inform you that all of the people around you are out to get you, and I'm going to save you. I mean, this is terrific. There's nobody who would ever think like this other than Martin Luther. There's nobody so free as to say, I'm going to free the Pope. And specifically, I'm going to free the Pope from the Vatican. Because they were all in there trying to get him. So he says, I'm going to do this. I'm going to save him. And how do you save anyone? How do you save the Pope? Well, you give him a sermon. So Luther gives him an open letter, he says. It's a love letter. Everybody thought it was strange because Luther himself published it. He first gave it to Miltitz, this bureaucrat. Miltitz looked at it and his jaw dropped. So he says, I put it on the shelf, and I wrote another one, signed it as if it were Luther, and that's the one he sent over to the Pope, which was, can I say ass kissing? No, I can't say. It was saying everything you were supposed to say to the Pope, and Miltitz said that one instead. Luther says, you're not getting away with that, so he published the letter that he wrote along with the freedom of a Christian at the same time, so everybody could see. Even to this day, people said, how can he speak so lovingly and kindly and nicely to the Pope? I mean, goodness sakes, this is like Obama talking to Trump at the funeral service. They're laughing and having fun. Everybody says, how in the world can something like this happen? So Luther sent the letter as well. By the way, this is just the warm-up. So remember, you've got two contrary theses that are going to be laid out from 1 Corinthians 9:19. Then you also have the open love letter of Jesus to the Pope, telling the Pope, I'm here to save you. And then Luther now lays this out in the form of a sermon. So he's going to use a sermon to save the Pope. Then in the sermon, not only does he open up his two theses that he's going to lay out, but he's also, and he's going to tell us about freedom, but then famously he lays out what are called the three powers of faith. That's where this actually comes. Some of you may have heard this. So time allowing, of course, and who knows what happens between now and 4:30. We could all be in heaven, in which case I'll just keep going. And we'll finish this whole thing, but I'm going to see if we can't get all three powers. And then the three powers, as Luther lays them out, are really wild. Each one gets wilder and wilder. And whoever thought that faith itself was a power, and not only one power, but three, then when he's done with all of that, he stops and now says, I'm now going to tell you not what freedom you have, what power you have in freedom. I'm now not going to talk about that any longer. I'm going to talk about how to enslave yourself properly, effectively, and well. How to actually make yourself a slave to everyone. And so in the last part, he's now laying out, and of course he's telling the Pope, dear Pope, this is how you are actually going to do this yourself. You're going to enslave yourself to other people and not lord it over them, okay? So here we go. Luther starts writing this letter to the Pope, and also then finally his two theses that he gathers from 1 Corinthians 9:19. Luther was aware that the very Pope he intended to set free was preparing to execute him as a wild boar. Execute. He was going to excommunicate him. And of course, there he was going to use the big excommunication and the small excommunication. There were two of them. And one would excommunicate you from the state. You couldn't be a citizen any longer. And the other one was going to excommunicate you from the church, which meant you were excommunicated from heaven forever. And the Pope was in the process of doing this with Luther, and Luther knew it. Luther knew that the Pope was preparing to excommunicate him, but Luther was convinced that Leo had been bamboozled by his own holy see. He was getting a little bit addled himself. It's a little bit like having, you wouldn't possibly conceive of this, but it's a little bit like having a president who doesn't really know where he is. And then there are people around him who are bamboozling him into thinking one thing or another about what he's doing. Who knows if that could ever happen. And nevertheless, Luther now says, I think you have, dear Pope, I think you have been bamboozled by the Holy See into thinking that you are God's vicar on earth who had power to free and bind, that is, absolve sin, on earth and in heaven. They tricked you into thinking that you had that you could actually sign a presidential statement. And that's the way that this would actually work. To disabuse you of this lie, Luther then proceeds, I have decided to preach from a single phrase in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a slave to all, that I might win more of them. There's his text, 1 Corinthians 9:19. The Pope had set his entire teaching of Christianity and his own office of papacy upon the single proposition of the Golden Rule, as if the Golden Rule was what Christianity was all about. Love God above all, love your neighbor as yourself. And Luther recognized that he had been bamboozled. That is not what Jesus Christ has come to teach. If that's all Jesus Christ came to teach, Moses did it just as well and probably better than Jesus Christ. And so now he's actually going to teach the Pope that it is not the golden rule that the church stands on. A man is free to this is what the golden rule says. A man is free to the extent that he loves God above all and his neighbor as in himself. That is, you are free to the extent that you do that. Now, what happens once you start to get this in the church over and over again? You say, well, I'm not as free as I thought I was because I'm not as advanced in either one of these things. And if that's what makes my freedom, then I'm in trouble because I don't have much freedom. To counter this, Luther says, I am now going to set out freedom according to Paul's two propositions. They go like this. A Christian is a perfectly free lord of all, subject to none. A Christian is a perfectly dutiful, bound slave to all, subject to all. Luther says, there you have it. That's the Christian life. Two contrary theses. They not only are a little bit unlike, they say exactly the opposite. And nevertheless, I am going to hold both of these. And he says, if we can find some way that these actually unite, then we're going to have a breakthrough, and we're actually going to hear something that has never been heard before in the church. Clearly, these two propositions are contrary, he says. They cannot be used as a logical syllogism in a disputation. In fact, they oppose Aristotle's basic law of non-contradiction. That fact did not deter Luther. These two theses seem to contradict each other if, however, they should be found to convenire together, to fit together. They would serve our purpose beautifully, he says. Now, I just want to say that most of you try to convenire with other people through love, but you're not very good at it. When you convenire with people through love, you're trying to fit with another person through love. And a lot of you actually do think that you are quite good lovers in that way. But I beg to differ, and the Pope thought he was the very best one. Luther now is trying to give him another notion of what this actually means. How can they not only describe freedom, these two contrary theses, but also give it? So remember, you've heard this on a number of occasions. How do you stop simply talking about faith and actually give faith to another person? Since that's always the question, and we've been talking here about, how do you teach other people to preach? How do you actually do that? Or how do you teach them not only how to absolve another person, but actually absolve them and actually make it happen? And Luther is now saying, I'm going to help you, dear Pope. I'm going to show you how this happens, because I know that nobody in the world has ever actually given you faith, and I'm the man to do it. Yet, how could such contraries come together? How can they not only describe freedom, but give it? The first point is that Luther's definition of freedom does not apply to the human in general, but only a Christian in particular. Unlike the philosophers who start with human nature in general, Luther begins with the specific, elected, accidental experience of faith. Some have this faith in Christ, some do not. Have you ever noticed this? So when you're walking around out there in the world, some people have faith in Christ, some people do not. Then you say to yourself, how does this happen? How did that one get it and this one not get it? How did I get it and another one not get it? Now we have a clear answer. You weren't born with it. You didn't have it inside yourself. Somebody gave it to you. Now Luther is going to say, he lays out the specific contrast that Christian faith teaches, which Generalized love does not. His two theses or utterances of Christian freedom are almost identical, but for two words, free Lord versus bound servant, and none versus all. The sentence is exactly the same except for the subject of the sentences and the object of the sentences. In both cases, the key difference concerns the Christian's relation to the law of God. What happens to you when you are above the law is that you are Lord. So when Luther says, Lord of all, he's saying you are above the law. That's what that means. Because all of this depends on the relationship that you have with the law. He's trying to teach the Pope this because the Pope thinks, well, I love the law because I'm the law. And whatever I say is, I mean, who wouldn't love the law in that particular case? Now Luther is saying, no, you're not the law. And if you were the law, it wouldn't save you in any circumstance. However, if it were the case that we ever had anyone who was actual Lord in this world, that one would be above the law. And what happens to you when you are a slave is that you are beneath the law. So now Luther is going to say, this is what we have to put together. When we talk about ourselves, we have to talk about ourselves as one who is Lord and one who is slave. The one who is Lord is above the law. The other one is a servant who is below the law. That's what that means. So now Luther says, I know you're going to get a little bit mixed up about this because you would say to yourself, excuse me, Luther, I like the idea that somehow this tells me about the law, but I can't be both above the law and below the law at the same time, can I? Now Luther says, oh, you're getting warm. Oh, dear Pope, we're getting you closer and closer. We've got something coming here for you. We're even going to give it to you in Latin because that's all the Pope ever wanted to speak in Latin. It's called the simile. At the same time, and now Luther is going to teach the Pope the simile, who otherwise had no idea what this was. Instead, Luther is sure that a free Christian is not one person with two aspects, but is truly two persons who are opposite each other. He thinks this distinction will reveal to the Pope and to all Christendom that the thing that saves us is not love, the golden rule, but it is faith. Faith and love are in fact opposites to begin with. Only later can we say how they fit together as opposites without introducing any imaginary free will in between them. Remember, the main reason why people don't believe that they're two is not just because, that's one's above and one's below. That doesn't make any sense. It's because they actually have put something between those two that they think really makes them who they are. And of course, Luther's going to point out to the Pope, that's a little fairy princess that you made up in your head, which is called free will. That is somehow standing between these two and then deciding which direction it's going to go day in and day out. Am I going to go above the law? Am I going to go below the law? Today I feel high. Tomorrow I feel low, and so on. No, this is not how this is going to work. Instead, you're going to see now that faith alone saves, and only faith produces actual love in the end. Love does nothing by itself. Once he unpacked why Christian freedom is two opposite things or two opposite people at the same time, Luther intended to say how they fit together freely. He calls this taking up something even more remote than what it means for a Christian to be both above and below the law by employing another of Paul's neologisms. You know, somebody suggested that we should get nice little phrases that come from Gerhard Forde. We could do the same with Luther. I'll bet somebody has done that for Luther out there. But the one to really do it with is Paul. Paul had neologisms just like crazy. And so Luther is going to pull one of these out. It's 2 Corinthians 4:16. Though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed every day. That's wild. Because now it's saying I have an outer nature and I have an inner nature. Okay, well, you know I'd like to go on forever as if we were in heaven. Paul knew that outer self and inner self was commonly used outside of anything having to do with Jesus Christ. The Greek philosophers just loved this kind of thing. So they all said, well, yes, I mean, we all have an inner self and an outer self. Often, all of you, in one way or another, think of yourself this way. So you say, I've got an inner thing going on and I've got an outer thing going on. Then you say, the outer thing is just what people see. It's the sort of shell of me. It's my arms and legs and so on. But what really matters is what's inside me. And what's inside me is some sort of little secret heart. And if only I could see beyond the outside into the inside, then I would see the real you, that I would get to your real heart. This is the basis of all Hallmark movies. It says that you have to break down, what did they say? You have to break down their walls. Those terrible men, they have walls up all over the place. You have to break them out, and then you have to race through the crack in the wall, and then you have to get to their inner heart. When you finally get to their inner heart, then you find out that they're really, really lovable underneath all of that terrible outside stuff. The Greeks have said this for years. Then they said something else. They said that the way that the outer and inner actually work is that you have to work day in and day out on your inner self, and you have to make your inner self better so that it actually rises. Now it's not just an inner self, it's an inner self who's down here below, but trying to get up high into heaven. So Plato even said, I'll give you an example. It's like somebody running in a chariot, and the chariot has two horses, and one horse is pulling down, and the other horse is going up, and you are the charioteer. You're trying to direct how you're going to go, and you know that you want to go high, you want to go up. Everybody else goes low, we go high, and as that happens, then you have to learn how it is that you're going to move your chariot, and by God, what is the power that you have in the chariot? You have the power of free will, so that you're going to pull the outer self upward. You're going to move your inner self up until it finally enters into the divine itself and becomes one with God, into something that the Greeks called it's quite a wonderful word. They say you are going to participate with God. When you go high enough, when you go far enough, and when you've used your will well enough, Luther says, that's baloney. None of that is true. Paul is saying this also, that has nothing to do any longer with what we mean by the outer and the inner. In fact, this is now the way that Luther's putting this is going to finally remove this notion of free will entirely. Now, before Luther's sermon, power had come to refer the supposed capacity of the hand that we turn into a goat stag. That's you all know the goat stag now. It's a myth. That's a fake. Most of you see this. Don't you have some sort of good smelling scent out there that you're supposed to put in your underarms? And there's a goat stag that is half girl and half horse or something like that. And she says, use this. Even somebody who's half horse and half girl can actually smell good. And in this way now, you develop a goat stag. Luther says, this is all a goat stag. And the goat stag is that you have a free will, and it's made up of part inner self and part outer self, but the inner self gets control. Takes control, and then actually moves you in the proper direction. But that is not at all what power of faith it is that God gives. Luther now says, my inner self, in truth, is Christian. That is, it has faith. My outer self, now, we'll take up later. I'm actually going to use my faith to subject my outer self. And when I do, I'm actually going to, we heard this earlier, get a vocation for the first time in life. You all were wondering, how do you get a vocation? How do you tell other people to get a vocation? Well, you have to actually teach them how to put their old outer selves under the law again in such a way that it gives you no benefit, but it is going to give somebody else a lot of benefits. In the meantime, Luther now says, here's the amazing thing. My inner self is the self that has faith. How did I get this inner self? Was it a soul I was born with? And does my soul yearn deep inside to return to its double gonger out there in some way or another so that I can unite again with the parts that I had been separated from? By the way, this is all Plato. Luther says, no, that's not at all what is going on inside you. What is going on inside you is that you have absolutely no faith or you have faith. Then Luther says, what happens when your insides actually have faith? How did it get there? It got there for one reason and one reason only. There was a word that was said to you, and that word that was said to you gave you faith. That's how it happened. Then Luther says, this is what I've been trying to say all along. I got faith in my inner self the moment I got a preacher. I received the word from him, and that word was not a command, it was a promise. Now you heard about Lutheran Quarterly working with Oswald Bayer. This is where in 1520, this had happened just about a year earlier, but by 1520, Luther had understood what a promise was, and he understood that the way you get a preacher is not whoever is standing up in the pulpit, it is who is giving you a particular promise. And when the promise comes from the outside, it is a word. That word is none other than absolution. That absolving word actually now forgives your sin. And when it does it, it bestows and gives you a word of promise that will actually make you not only new, but eternal. You will have a new eternal life. It's not going anywhere. There's nothing else that you need to do about it. And by the way, it's so free, there isn't anything other to say about it than it's free. And you're not trying to improve it. You're not trying to anything like this. But you have this particular word. When the word comes to you, it now has actually made that faith. And for the first time, you have an inner self that is free. Once that inner self is free, then you can start identifying a series of powers. Now, our time is up. Some of you are already glazing over at the stained glass windows. We'll have to do this another time, but will you at least let me say this? The first power is the power of getting a preacher with an external word. The power, for the first time you'll understand this, the power is not in you. The power is in the word. You keep thinking there's got to be a power in me. I've got to be able to somehow find it. And then I have to make use of it. That's what life is all about. No. The power of faith is a power of the word. The word has the power. You don't have the power. And you know which word has the power? Promise. A promise. And that promise word has more power in it than a nuclear bomb. This has power that you did not know existed. It has power to create a new person that will never die. Then there's a second faith, a second power of faith. Not only do you get this word from the outside, but you get it in the form of a promise, and the promise is being made to you not by your local pastor, but by God himself. Pastor is being used for this, but God himself is giving you this promise in his Son, Jesus Christ. So in the Son, Jesus Christ, he turns to you and he makes the promise to you. And he says, the sin that was yours now belongs to me. I have taken it to the cross and defeated it. I nailed it to the cross, as Peter himself says. I nailed it to the cross, and there it is. There it will stay. It will never belong to you again. And I now make this promise that you are free. And when I say you are free indeed. Now, when he does this, there's a second power in here. This means that everything depends not on your power to believe it, but on his faithfulness in giving it. So your faith comes from an external word. That word is a promise. It comes from Jesus Christ. And guess what? Jesus Christ is faithful, even if you're unfaithful. That's why Paul keeps saying it. What happens if you're unfaithful? As if that could ever happen. Then he says, never mind, Christ is faithful. Now, what happens in the second power? Christ's faithfulness to his own promise, despite your weird unfaithfulness and inability to do anything, it actually is sure and certain. Luther says, for the first time in your life, you will experience something that no one else experiences. You will be absolutely sure about something. You have to think about this. The rest of your life has been spent in uncertainty. That's why everybody's anxious. Everybody is nervous and anxious. They're all anxious. And what are they anxious about? Because they don't know what's coming next. They're uncertain. Now, Luther says, here's the second power. For the first time in your life, you have absolute assurance. Absolute certainty. Nobody else has that. You can't find it anywhere else. Oh, yes, there's a third power. And the third power is also taken from Paul in Ephesians. Maybe one of Paul's students, but one of Paul's students was fooling around anyway with a very good description. He said, all of you understand husband and wife getting married, but you haven't really understood it until you understand that you are actually married to Jesus Christ. And when you're married to Jesus Christ, it is an intoxication. So the best description of this is not, look, I've got a trophy Jesus on my side, and I can go around town and say, look at who I'm married to. It's Jesus Christ. I mean, look at the rest of you. You're all losers, and I've got Jesus Christ. No. Now we say the third power of faith is to be wed to Jesus Christ in such a way that you can't tell the difference between yourself and Jesus Christ, and you are united, well, I can't even talk this way to you, on the marriage bed. So now Luther says, what happens there? Whatever you had before now becomes Jesus Christ's. And whatever Christ had before you were wed now becomes yours. Give me a quick rundown. What would you say you brought to the wedding? What did you bring to Jesus Christ that he thought, he's so wonderful, she's so beautiful, I've got to have her? No, what you have is sin, death, and the devil. And you know what? Jesus goes right ahead and marries himself to it. By the way, what does Jesus Christ have and what do you get in this exchange? It's usually called a happy exchange. It's very happy indeed. Very joyous. What does Christ have that he gives you that now belongs to you? Faith. What else? Eternal life. This is what you have. And the defeat of the devil so that there is no more talking from the devil into your ear. All of that is gone. And all of this has happened in the third power of faith. Another time, then we'll sit down and say, well, then what does a Christian do who has now been wed to Christ and now is so free and so absolutely certain, and there is nothing that freedom is for other than freedom itself? Well, here's what he does. He subjects himself back under the law as an old creature, not for his own sake or his own righteousness, but so that he can be of some use to the neighbor. We'll have to take that up another time. Blessings to all of you as you go, and I am very glad to be a part of this, and I'm glad to be connected to 1521 in this particular way. I hope that continues. What you're seeing right here is actually in the form of a book, so I'm going to ask 1521 to help me get this published, since who else would possibly do that? And in the meantime, blessings to all of you as you go, and thank you again for this very important work that you're doing. And whether you knew it or not, when you joined your 1521 foundation, you were a free Christian, married to Jesus Christ, free as a bird, and you nevertheless enslaved yourself so that you could be useful to your neighbor. Thank you.